Some time ago, I read an article called 6 Cultures of Play by the Retired Adventurer. I'll link to it below. It's occupied my thoughts for a long time, and like a pot bubbling over, I just have to let some of those thoughts out. The article is about different RPG playstyles, their cultures and communities. Some of it I was aware of, some of it I recognised, and some I was not familiar with. It helped me think about my own preferences and assumptions, and made me reconsider some of the interactions and misunderstandings I've seen at the table, when different people had different expectations from their game. And so many times I've seen those misunderstandings come up online. We all have a tendency to assume our preferred style is more correct or more common than others, and so sometimes you might be recommended a game that just isn't right for you. I strongly recommend reading the original article that inspired this video, but here I want to talk about some of the playstyles I've seen, their culture and history, and recommend a couple of games I think are well suited to that style. The goal is to help people think about their own preferred playstyles and what games to consider looking into, where you're more likely to find people with similar expectations. On screen now are the playstyles I intend to talk about, and there are chapters below if you want to skip to sections you're more interested in. A couple of caveats at this point. First, I don't believe anyone can be put into a pigeonhole, and I personally enjoy most of the styles on this list. Second, games also can't be put into pigeonholes. They can have multiple descriptors, and I also agree with the Retired Adventurer's position that it's a bit misleading to say that a game belongs to a playstyle, when really the playstyle is a function of the people at the table. But since games might encourage one playstyle over another, I'll probably end up referring to a game as if it does belong to a playstyle, just as a shorthand. Third, these are my personal descriptions. This is not a definitive or prescriptive list, and these are definitely not the only playstyles that exist. I'm coming at this from a Western, English-speaking perspective, and with my own subjective experience and opinions. So, let's get into it. My table is a little empty for this one, because honestly, I'm not experienced with the classic style, but I can't not mention it. It comes from those very early days of RPGs, when they were transitioning from miniature wargames to adventure games. The playstyle of this era pits the players against the environment and challenges them to beat the game using their own wits and knowledge. The game master is more of a referee than a storyteller, and the flow of the game might feel more like a board game with rounds and turns and phases than the freeform styles we're used to today. One of the earliest adopters was Tunnels and Trolls, which has some modern additions and has the honour of being both the second ever tabletop RPG and the first to publish solo gamebooks. I do want to note here that there is a distinction between the classic style and the old-school revival style, but there are retro-modern OSR games available with quality-of-life improvements that might be suited to that early adventure wargame feel, like Shadow Dark, which is super popular at the moment, or 4 Against Darkness, which is a solitaire dungeon crawler with optional co-op play. In the late 70s, people started seeing the narrative potential of RPGs. There's a story that Laura and Tracy Hickman were playing a D&D module and encountered a vampire in a dungeon, leading them to ask, why is there a vampire in this dungeon? That question pushed them to publish hugely successful, story-focused modules and eventually develop settings that are still popular to this day, like Dragonlance and Ravenloft. The traditional style they and others pioneered is about being presented with an interactive story to influence an experience, usually in the form of pre-published adventures. The role of the GM is elevated to storyteller rather than referee, and they're expected to provide an immersive experience for the players. This style is the one you're most likely to encounter at your local gaming clubs, groups gathering to play a one-shot or short published adventures. To find the right system for trad play, you're looking for games with tactical combat and a good amount of published adventures, or tools for crafting them. Paizo games like Starfinder and Pathfinder are always well supported, with plenty of modules and a thriving community. And one of the cleverest takes I've seen on a traditional style is the magical land of Yeld, which makes it super easy to design those pre-written adventures. Here we're getting into a more modern style of play, with roots in the 90s, in games like Vampire the Masquerade, and then in the 2000s with Fate and Apocalypse World. This story game style is less concerned with the traditional RPG elements like dungeons and combat, and rather than relying on the GM, it treats the players as the prime drivers of the narrative. The GM's role is often restricted to give players as much agency as possible, and they're encouraged to do little to no prep work. Unlike traditional games, pre-prepared adventures aren't the norm. Instead, the plot is generated at the table and taken in any direction the players feel best suits the story. They tend to evoke the feelings and tropes of other fictional media, like caper movies in Blades in the Dark, or TV serials in Monster of the Week. And so you'll find story games tend to make more assumptions about the kind of characters or world you'll be playing than more open-ended traditional games. There are two system families that are really popular in the story game scene: Powered by the Apocalypse and Forged in the Dark. Some publishers specialise in these styles, like Evil Hat, Magpie Games and Mythworks, so looking through their catalogue is a good place to start. As for specific games, Blades in the Dark by John Harper is super popular and has a big expansion coming up. And The Wild Sea, which has a similar rule set, is one of the most beautiful books you can own, even if you never play it. So, what is an old school renaissance? I hope OSR fans will forgive me for this analogy, but it's like the synth wave of RPGs, in that it feels like the 80s, but it's actually quite modern. The aim is to recreate the feeling of the old school, or use the ideas from those early days in a modern, more refined context, and so for that reason it doesn't get lumped in with the classic style. Perhaps the two most important features of OSR games are: 1, the game provides a challenge to the real-world abilities of the player, and 2, the GM isn't overburdened by rules, but instead is trusted to make common-sense rulings in the moment. The result is meant to be a nimble and open experience. You might see how this philosophy clashes a little with the story game style. Story games tend to restrict the power of a GM and give the characters narrative abilities based on their personalities, while OSR games want to leave GMs alone and focus more on the player's choices than the characters. That doesn't mean you can't enjoy games in both camps, but it can cause some arguments. Otherwise, the worlds of OSR games might feel more sandboxy, and its characters are often grounded and mundane rather than superpowered and heroic. There's often a lot of cross-compatibility within the OSR scene, so content from one game can easily slot into another. The heavy metal dark fantasy of Morkborg is super popular, with loads of different hacks available, like the cyberpunk Cyborg. And while I tend to think of OSR games as dark and grim, you'll also find some bright fantasy options that might fit the bill, like the anime-inspired Break and the fantasy mechs of Ether Nexus. In the early 2010s, there was a bit of a split between the narrative and the traditional crowds. There was a hole to fill in the middle, an appetite for a hybrid style where the GM presents an interactive world but the players are able to shape the story. And in the late 2010s, that hybrid style exploded. This is the style made incredibly popular by big podcasts like Critical Role, Dimension 20 and High Rollers, where each cast member is important and the role of the GM is to let them shine. The Cultures of Play article refers to this style as OC or Neo-Trad, though I'm not sure if they're the most helpful names anymore, because in the last couple of years, I've seen Neo-Trad games become a bit more focused. Some have gone in a more tactical direction, and others in a more narrative. Narrative-leaning Neo-Trad games are increasingly providing tools that let players and GMs collaborate on world-building and storytelling instead of relying solely on the GM's creativity. So recently, I've been referring to this style as collaborative. Collaborative games tend to be action-heavy with high-drama role-playing. Combat can be both tactical and narratively focused, where every fight is important to the plot, and homebrewing is the norm. Sometimes the GM has resources to spend on twists and complications, codifying their power. There was a tendency in this scene to play whatever game was popular, particularly that one game, but now there are games specifically catering to this collaborative style, drawing a lot of inspiration from their story game cousins. Personally, I absolutely love Fabula Ultima, a JRPG-inspired game where collaboration between the GM and players is built in. Similarly, and perhaps unsurprisingly, Daggerheart is a good go-to, with less focus on tactical combat. But if you want a bit more of a traditional grid-based approach, keep an eye on Draconim by Crossed Paths. On the more combat-heavy end of the Neo-Trad spectrum is the style I'll call tactical, but maybe a more descriptive name would be rules-light role-playing, rules-heavy combat. Games in this style can transition from free-form narrative conversation into a squad tactics game in the same way that a CRPG like Baldur's Gate does. The style shares a similar history with collaborative games, perhaps starting when the traditional and narrative camps turned their backs on 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons. But that doesn't mean that 4th edition wasn't liked. Its clear rules and video gamey style absolutely had its appeal and lent itself to a new hybrid style of freeform role-playing and deeply tactical combat. And although Wizards of the Coast left that style behind in 2014, the torch was carried by games like 13th Age. The thing is, many of the large influx of players who joined the scene in the last decade are used to computer RPGs and are happy with video gamey elements. And so, with a new audience, the tactical style is having a resurgence. And if you like freeform role-playing with crunchy tactical combat, you might enjoy the utopian mech-based space opera Lancer, or the bright heroic fantasy Beacon. If you've watched any of my reviews before, you're probably aware that nearly all RPGs can be played without a GM, either in a group or alone. It's worth mentioning though, because it's not obvious. The vast majority of games assume that one player will act as a guide in some way, but they don't have to be played like that. Just like you can homebrew in a new class to play, you can homebrew a virtual GM using tools like the Mythic GM emulator, which you can either add onto the multiplayer system of your choice, or even theoretically use as a standalone solo system. And lots of designers these days are adding those tools into games that were originally intended as multiplayer experiences, like Dragonbane's Alone in Deepfall Breach. There are also games designed from the ground up to be played without a GM. But either way, to play this style, you generally want to look for games and tools that include random tables, oracles, and virtual GMs. What to recommend here depends very much on which other playstyles you enjoy. But on the old school end of the spectrum, I haven't tried it, but people tend to say good things about the dungeon crawler Nathalos. And on the narrative end, Ironsworn Starforged has galaxies full of storytelling tools. And I think distinct even from the GMless style is the creative writing style. Lots of GMless games will encourage you to journal your adventure in as much or as little detail as you like, but some games are all about writing out a story, usually in an epistolic way, like writing letters, recording logs, or even podcast episodes. Games suited to longer form creative writing tend to use lists of prompts more than oracles. What I mean by that is that GMless games often have you asking questions of a virtual GM, then rolling on a table and interpreting the result to determine what happens. Whereas creative writing games will often have you drawing a card and looking up the corresponding prompt, which will give you a scenario and ask you to record your reaction to it. It's a very different style from the others on this list, and possibly tough to get into. So I'd recommend games that have more familiar RPG elements to get started with, like Colossal, which feels very much like a classic but unique overland adventure, or For Small Creatures Such as We, which is a sandboxy space game akin to Firefly or Becky Chambers novels. If you really want to dive into it though, people often recommend 1000-Year-Old Vampire, and although I haven't properly tried it out myself yet, Koriko A Magical Year is a lovely cozy game akin to Kiki's Delivery Service. Thank you ever so much for watching, and once again a massive thank you to this month's Ko-fi supporters. This is a bit of a departure for this channel, an extra video to slot in between reviews, just because I have a bit of time off and have been thinking about this subject for a while. I hope it's helpful, and if it was, please do subscribe to discover a new game every couple of weeks or so, because next week we'll be back to the regular schedule. So until then, happy adventures!